Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Shannon McGinnis. I am one of the founding board members of CAIC, and I also serve as CAIC's Director of Education. And I'm really thrilled to be joined tonight by three terrific colleagues and dear friends of mine. All are who outstanding professionals in their field and also phenomenal teachers. And the three of them are, like so many of us, weathering the challenges of COVID-19, not only professionally, kind of in their own professional work, but also with respect to their interactions and their work with students. And so I thought it would be interesting this evening just to have a conversation about the challenges, of course, which we talk about a lot, but also wanted to have the opportunity to focus a bit on some of the silver linings. So we've titled this episode Silver Linings to Online Learning. And I thought it would be nice to speak with LYNN EUSTIS, Nicholas Hutchinson, and Dana Brown about what they've learned, what they've experienced during this really extraordinary time, and what they've learned and what kind of tips they might be carrying ahead with them after everything kind of gets back to quote unquote normal. I will go ahead and invite Dana, Lynn, and Nick to go ahead and join us on the screen. In the meantime, I would also invite all of you out there to contribute to the conversation. I'm sure some of you have your own experiences, either as performers, as students, as teachers. I'd love to invite your questions or comments. So please do feel free to pop those into the chat on Facebook, and they'll get to me, and we'll make sure to address those. So without further ado, welcome, my dear friends. Welcome, LYNN EUSTIS, Dana Brown, and Nicholas Hutchinson. So glad to have you here tonight, and really looking forward to the conversation. I thought that we would start. I think probably a lot of people in our audience know each of you in different contexts. Lynn, you were here last season at CAIC for a master class. Dana Brown is a wonderful pianist and coach here in Chicago and on the faculty at the Chicago College of Performing Arts with me. And Nicholas Hutchinson, of course, is our esteemed Executive Director of CAIC, also a fantastic pianist and educator, does a lot of work at DePaul University. So I'm sure we all have some familiarity. I introduced you a little bit, and I promised you I'd let you do that yourselves, but I would love to start things by just having you introduce yourselves. Tell us where you are in the world at this particular moment in time. Maybe just give us some context about what your normal career and occupation look like when we're not in the midst of a pandemic. And then maybe just a word or two about what your teaching and interactions with students have looked like over the past 10 months. Are you working remotely, partially remotely? Kind of just give us some context about that. So why don't we start with Lynn, who comes from the furthest away.
Good evening, everyone. I am currently an associate professor of voice and director of graduate studies in music for the College of Fine Arts at Boston University. So I'm up here in Boston, where we only got 2 inches of snow this week. Very happy about that. I'm currently on sabbatical. So right now I'm just teaching a little bit privately and doing some writing and some reading and studying and various things. Obviously, I had lots of grand travel plans that have been postponed or pushed forward or canceled, as we have all been impacted in that way by the conditions around us. I have been teaching fully remotely since March, whatever the date that was, right in the middle of it all. And it was a shock, of course, at first for all of us. And going forward into the fall, I actually have a workplace adjustment at Boston University to teach fully remotely, because Boston is running a hybrid program, and which has been incredibly successful due to a whole lot of daily, well, not daily, but several times weekly testing of students, faculty, staff, everybody. So it has, so far, knock on wood, has not run into any big shutdowns, which is great. But in order to remain fully remote, which obviously for a singer, it's not safe to be in a small room with singers, I applied for and received a workplace adjustment based on a health condition I have, which If you want to know more about it, shameless book plug, my recent book about this, A Singer's Epiphany, Faith, Music, and Mortality. It's all about that. So that's basically where things are for me.
Excellent. Thank you. Nicholas Hutchinson, tell us where you are in the world and what's going on.
Hey everyone, I'm in Chicago, and as a lot of you know, I'm the executive director of CAIC, and that's involved a lot of challenges, which everyone who's a member of our audience knows that now everything's getting presented online, which was a real challenge and a real shift for us. I also run a summer music program for middle school and high school students, which has been going on for a little over 40 years now. And this last summer was the first summer that we couldn't have camp in person. So we also had to pivot and figure out how to do lessons online and classes. And, you know, how do you take the idea of everyone hanging out together at camp and try to replicate that on Zoom. So I had a lot of really great people on that staff who came up with all sorts of interesting ideas to do that. And we're also going to have to do that this summer because things aren't going to be quite settled enough for us to be able to do the program again. And then a lot of what I do is I'm a pianist coach on the voice faculty at DePaul University. And normally as part of that, I teach a whole bunch of different diction classes. I have a class on recitative every other year. We do 3 operas every year, and I musically prepare those and would usually be playing the staging rehearsals and all of that right now. And I do weekly individual coachings during winter term, which is the term that we're in now, for upper class people and graduate students. So we've been able to preserve a lot of that. I mean, we're essentially fully remote. We have a fairly new building, so we're fortunate in having setups that they've come up with where they'll put a student on stage in one of the performance halls. The teacher will be in the recording booth for that hall, and then they'll put a piano in the green room so that then a pianist can be playing for a lesson, and they've sort of wired all of that up. I'm, however, not taking advantage of that because that's, prime, teaching real estate. So I've been doing all of my coaching remotely, and obviously we're not doing opera productions, so we've pivoted and been doing video projects instead. And we have a recording studio in our new building where I'm in one airspace and the singer can be in another airspace and the recording engineer can be in a different room. So we've been able to do that, but that's really the only time in about a year now that I've been playing in real time for a singer. So that's been a real change so far, to go from, relying on having a piano in front of me and being able to steer the ship in my teaching, even during classroom teaching in that way, to just sort of being me and having to use words to describe things instead of playing. So it's been quite a shift.
Dana, how about you?
Hi, everybody. I'm happy to be here. I'm an associate professor of opera and vocal coaching at the Chicago College of Performing Arts at Roosevelt University, where Shannon and I are colleagues and have been for some time. Normally at this time of the year, I'm heavily involved in the graduate opera. Last year when the pandemic hit, we had just finished King Arthur of Purcell in the Studebaker Theater in downtown Chicago. And thank goodness, we dodged a bullet with that. That was March 5 and 6. And then we had spring break, and then we had another week of spring break, and then we were head into the pandemic. I coach graduate students and undergraduates on a weekly basis and teach a class called Graduate Seminar Topics for the Professional Singer with the second-year master students, and also teach the Grad Vocal Collaborative Piano class. Last spring, we did everything on Zoom. This summer, I spent a lot of time with technology and exploring different avenues of things that we might be able to use. And near the end of the summer, a friend of mine said, "Hey, you ever heard of Jam Kazam?" And I looked it up and I loaded it onto my computer and thought, well, let's see how we can make this work. And many of us at our school actually ended up using it last semester. I was doing a bit of in-person coaching. One of the silver linings, literally, is the fact that our school sits mostly empty most of the time. So all of the very large rooms are available. So I'm playing the piano with a mask while the singer is at least 25 feet away from me. And I've had a few brave souls willing to come in, and that's kind of saved me over the last few months. This semester, we've been doing Zoom so far, but we're going to go back to Jam Kazam. And I have found that, when you don't have collaboration for a while and all of a sudden you're on Jam Kazam and everything is hooked up, you can just see the smiles on people's faces. All of a sudden it's like, oh my God, he can hear me. And he's actually breathing with me, and man, we got a good connection today, and we're just going to really sail with this. And I have found I choose to remain very surprised about the kinds of things that can happen within that little box on Jam Kazam or on Zoom. And I think for certain students, it's been a great surprise to see how much can get done, and also absorbing the private space and all the individual attention that they are receiving. We are also doing a Mozart opera project this semester. It's all students recording an operatic aria of Mozart in 2 different ways. I'm going to play a lot of those live with me halfway across the room. That'll be done in March, and that is essentially our spring opera for this year. So we're lamenting the loss of actual opera. I miss seeing opera live and partaking in it, and we're all doing the best we possibly can. I think we all have to acknowledge that pandemic fatigue is real, and music can assuage us in so many ways, and I'm hoping that the public is ready for live music again, because I certainly miss it.
I think we all do. I know you'll get a lot of agreement from this panel and for all of those who are listening. Just a quick reminder, if you'd like to contribute to the conversation, to pop some comments or questions into the chat. But I wanted to kind of piggyback on something, or pick up on something that Dana mentioned. And we've talked a lot about technology and the different ways that we're using technology, and I'm sure that we'll continue to bring that into the discussion. But I was interested in something you said, Dana, about the students who have kind of, I'm not using your word, but blossomed in a way during this time, kind of unexpectedly. And I'm sure all of us have had that experience of several students who have somehow just kind of, this format has opened something in them for whatever reason. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit more to that. Dana, do you have a particular kind of situation in mind or student in mind that strikes you?
Sure. The most obvious example, as I said, I'm teaching grad vocal collab. So in August, I had not one idea what I was going to do, because we can't have a singer in the class. And my 2 students are in Asia. One's in China and one's in Korea. And so I sang and played Barbara Sure on the Shining Night during the first class. And I turned to the Zoom camera and say, could you do that? And they laughed, and I laughed. And then the next day, one of them sang and played it as well as I could have, and the other one spoke it and played it. And I said, you know what, we have a class. And because there are only 2 students in the class, they're normally more than that, because there are only 2 students in the class, I have watched these 2 young women absorb the interaction with the other student and with me in a way that's just been really fun to observe and be a part of. And, we make Zoom jokes and we'll say, oh, it's the Zoom that's causing these issues and things. But these are 2 young women who don't normally collaborate with singers, who are learning to sing and play on a regular basis, learning foreign languages, at least to the best of their ability, and being introduced to some fantastic repertoire, and so I make a big deal about the composers that pianists don't play, Puccini and Strauss, Chausson, etc., Berlioz, etc., and it's just been really fun to see them grow and adapt to a new kind of thinking. So that to me is the most obvious. I have a couple of coachees this semester who I think they really love the camera. I think they really love that little square box, and they also love the fact that there's a sense of privacy that maybe doesn't happen in person. I don't know. There's just something about it. So
Yeah, I've similar reactions. I was thinking of singers loving the camera being on them for sure. Lynn, how about you?
I think that there's definitely something about the camera and the less formal setting somehow when you're in your own home. Like some of my students who would come into my studio at the university and be, sort of with trepidation towards a lesson, felt a whole lot freer in their own living rooms than they do with other people at school hearing them, or any of that. So I think that's been really interesting. And watching, I have 5 students who did the district auditions recently for MONC, and watching them sort of just go for it in their living rooms, it's amazing to me, the courage that takes. And I think that seeing themselves on camera week after week after week now, they've gotten a lot less self-conscious about how they look when they sing. They have been able to address obvious bodily quirks that they had, or things that they didn't know they were doing. And it's a whole different thing too, to watch your recording of your lesson than it is to watch in the mirror while you're singing. If you're watching the recording, you can separate a little bit and see, oh yeah, I really do that all the time. So I think there's been a lot of that. And I think too, in the last spring, it was such a shock for everyone. And we were all everyone was trying to do the best they could. And all of my students did the best that they could. But I think this fall, when you knowingly walk into this remote environment and you know what it's going to be, you have to really want to do this more in a more intentional way than you did before. So I think a lot of music students have coasted along from degree program to degree program before this happened. And now, the ones that came, they've thrown themselves wholly into it in a way that has really made it work and really surprised me. And that resilience every week has just been so awe-inspiring to me, to see these young people say, this is not going to stop me from going out and pursuing this dream of mine. It's really astounding.
yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that, Lynn. I started this fall with one of my first coachings this past fall. Young student, junior this year, came in, and she's always been a terrific student, but a little bit kind of reticent to really fully engage. And she started her first coaching. I learned last spring that if I want to do this, like, I have to do it, right? Everything's been taken away, and if I'm going to do it, I got to bring my whole self. And she's just been a completely different student this year. So that really resonates with me. Nick, what about you? Any particular experiences?
I mean, I've certainly found, last spring, I think it was a shock for most of the singers that I work with to all of a sudden be put in a position where they didn't have a pianist really working with them. You didn't have a pianist in your lesson. You were doing coachings remotely, so there isn't a coach playing for you. And it was sort of, you could see people at first, it's like, oh, I've sort of discovered maybe I need to solidify some musicianship skills related to rhythm and pitches and all of that. And it's amazing now the difference in comfort level from then to now, where I'll go, oh, do you want to try it with a track? And they're just like, no. And I mean, people have improved their piano skills too, which is great to see, because that's never hurt a single singer in the world to be better at, being able to accompany themselves. So I've really loved seeing pretty much everyone just sort of step up. And I feel like they can all function much more independently as musicians now, a lot more than they would have if this whole pandemic hadn't happened.
Agreed. It's just been really impressive and heartwarming also to see. We've talked about all of you are doing kind of a myriad of things, a mix of live interaction, some remote interaction, some Zoom, some Jam Kazam. And I wonder if you can speak to kind of, I don't know, like in terms of technology, what you have found useful that you might even want to continue using when we don't have to, if that makes sense. Nick, anything that comes to mind? Or anybody can jump in.
I mean, I have to admit, I had never really taken advantage of the whole online course system that always existed before the pandemic. It just seemed like somehow an extra thing that wasn't really all that useful or necessary. And just basic things like having a syllabus. And now I'm teaching all of my classes asynchronously for a variety of reasons, just including where people are in the world and how much students are working and sharing technology with family members. So that seemed like an easier route for my classes. So now I have lecture notes for each of the lectures that I normally do for all of the different languages. And I have all of these materials that I'm certainly just going to leave up. And that's only something that will help when we go back to in-person teaching. I also discovered that I've been spending all sorts of effort on spreadsheets calculating students' grades, when in fact there was a whole system that would have just taken care of that for me all along. So that's been a really useful discovery. I'll also say we weren't as lucky as Roosevelt in terms of our last opera before the pandemic. We did the Marriage of Figaro and we got all the way to the final orchestral dress rehearsal and then got shut down the day before the opening night performance. But as part of that, I did a huge amount of work with recitative that was essentially all language work, to prepare students for that. And I remember now thinking back on it, how much effort I went to try to coordinate schedules and get room at school and all of that. And now I would think, I just do it on Zoom. There's no reason why you can do a huge amount of language work in particular over Zoom, and you've lost absolutely nothing by doing that. And it just makes everything more flexible. Like, you're not searching for space at school. You can open up a lot of things in your schedule that don't involve making, a special extra trip into your office and home. So I certainly, as much as people talk about Zoom fatigue, I'm looking forward to still incorporating this into teaching and meetings and connecting with people, honestly, going forward.
Yeah, anybody else? I have the same kind of reaction, Nick. I think about sometimes when I have to be away for one reason or another, and that involves makeup coachings, and now I'm thinking, well, actually in a hotel room, I could go ahead and do some coachings and make up, use the time very beneficially. Any other thoughts about that?
Yeah, along that same line, perspective lessons have never been easier. I've done so many more of them this year because you don't have to be in Boston to take a perspective lesson with me. So that's been really great. I think too that, like Nick, I use the online course management system a lot more this year to just incorporate digital media more intentionally into what I do. Posting recordings for them to watch with notes on what they're watching for, asking them to post introductory videos at the beginning of the semester. And I posted an awkward one of myself for them to see too, just so that we could all just build some kind of community within the studio. And then one thing that's maybe not so technical, but it's something I decided to do that I definitely plan to continue. I was worried about them not being able to just sort of drop by my office or come by and ask me about things, or just see me in the hall and ask that question. So I set up for them talk sessions, a half hour for every student every other week, just to come and chat with me about whatever they wanted to talk about. And some of them came and talked about auditions and repertoire, and some of them came and just complained about their day, and which is fine. And some of them brought their audition videos for me to share their screens, and we watched them together. It was a really targeted time to talk about those things away from the lesson. So that I will definitely keep that. Probably not in quite as big a time chunk, just because they will be able to drop by and see me. But I really liked it, separating that so completely from the lesson time. I thought that was a really useful tool.
I think I'm gonna
I
steal
love
that
that.
one, Lynn.
Yeah, I love that idea, Lynn, and I'm sure your students are feeling that. I have noticed that I am in much more communication with my students on a regular basis, and part of it is, you can say to your students that you have office hours. You can say that you're always available, or you're available when they have questions, etc. I have found that I am not particularly effective in getting people to come to office hours, as glamorous as that might seem, or just saying, you need to when you have questions, you should really reach out. Or why, or the less productive manner is, of course, to say, why didn't you reach out? Because then just people feel bad. So whenever any question comes up that has come up over the last now 3 semesters, I've just said, let's just talk about it. I'm sending you a Zoom invite and we're going to talk about this right now. And I have been very surprised at actually some of the things that came through, and people can be very candid about where they are and their feelings about things. And some of it might be to do with something that has to do with me, and some of it may have to do with something that's much more personal in nature. But I've also been very pragmatic about reaching out, about piano tracks. Since we're back on Zoom this semester, I'll just reach out and say, what are we going to coach on Tuesday, etc. And you get this little sense of surprise about, oh, my teacher's actually invested in me and really wants to know about this. I also have played a lot of music that I haven't played ever before in my life, partially because we're now adjusting to new diversity, equity, and inclusion standards, and students are looking at all other kinds of repertoire. My students in graduate seminar are going to do a marginalized composers recital, and been very pleased to see the kinds of things that they have chosen for this. So I'm learning new things, etc. And partially because of doing piano tracks in advance, I'll just say, oh, you know what, I took a look at that, and that's a very, very interesting song, and I really want to talk to you about the poem, and I really want to talk to you about the composer, etc. And so there are some conversations that are taking place that are on a deeper level than just, oh, it's my 30-minute coaching time, and in and out, etc. And I know Shannon and you and I have many complaints about 30-minute coachings, etc. It tends to feel a little revolving door some days. All my coachings are now at least 15 minutes apart because I'm switching rooms, etc., and I'm going from live to Zoom, etc. And I have found that little extra 5 minutes to actually say to somebody, really, how are things going? And I think we're all going through a version of, I feel like I'm working so hard, and yet it doesn't feel that way sometimes. We're all going through some of that, and just being able to share that with your students and to let them know sometimes that we are feeling it too is very important. And so those extra few minutes have brought me closer to my students.
It's a really great point. I always think of myself, I'm sure we all do, as empathic teachers and human beings, but I found myself having to be much more intentionally so, right? There's something about sharing physical space with a person where you kind of feed off one another's energy, and I think we're guilty of assuming a lot. And when we switched to this format, I found myself having to do exactly what Dana said, just take a deep breath, stop and actually ask, right? And take the time. And for me, that's something that is definitely going forward with me. It's just that level of intention around my empathy for my students.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel the same way, that I hope that I'm empathic most of the time, but without that sort of, hey, how are you doing when they come into the room? It's easy to just sort of feel like you have to deliver something right away. And I found that there's something kind of vulnerable about them sharing my home. They're in my home. Y'all are in my home now. And I'm in their home. And I have to tell you something funny that happens. Those of you who follow me on Facebook already read this comment, but things I never thought I would say during a voice lesson. Hold on a second, Fred's in the liquor cabinet. My cat Fred had opened the liquor cabinet and was trying to get in there. So we had to hold on a second. And it happened to be about 4:45 in the afternoon when this happened. So I came back to the lesson and my student didn't miss a beat and said, well, Dr. E, even Fred knows it's almost 5 o'clock. And we laughed so hard. It was so funny. But like stuff like that is just I have one student who has 2 children, and it's been really inspiring watching her say, mommy's in a lesson right now, mommy's in a lesson, close the door behind you. And then she comes back to the lesson. It's just been, but those kinds of interactions like that changes the whole dynamic between us and them. And that's I think mostly for the better.
Lynn, you've given new meaning to the term party animal.
There was a lot of hilarity about which spirit Fred might have chosen.
That's amazing. We do have a question, but I also would like to kind of pick up on something Dana said about this time is the difficulty, the challenges of this time are not only about COVID, right? Dana alluded to new DEI mandates that are not initiatives that are extremely important, and the level of awareness about racial inequity and just societal inequity in general is really at the forefront of all our minds and also all our students' minds. And I've found it so it's so difficult that it's all happening at once. But I think we're also, Dana alluded to this, there's a real opportunity around it, right? For our students to be so much more direct about what their concerns are and to find ways as artists to kind of confront those things. And I wonder if you want to talk about that a little bit more. Any particular experiences either of you, Nick or Lynn, have had with students around those issues, exploring new repertoire, or, and maybe not, that's okay. I just was thinking about it. It's been a big topic of conversation for Dana and me at our institution for a variety of reasons. And
it's
yeah,
a
Lynn.
big topic at BU, of course, in terms of our large ensemble repertoire and our operatic choices and all of that. And there's been a lot of conversation at BU about that. I think just from my own standpoint, I've been pleased to see students just taking initiative themselves to bring in a more diverse repertoire. And a lot of it, as Dana said, it's the same for me. A lot of it is repertoire I don't know. And we've had some interesting conversations, and I'm interested to hear from the coaches in the room about this, about, you know, all those old taboos about who should sing what. Like, I think those things are starting to fall away, and but it's still tricky to know exactly where those boundaries are.
Appropriation, yeah. I had a soprano I've done a lot of work with. She and I did a whole CD of composers of color. It has been her life's work. And I asked her this question point blank in the class just a week ago about, you know, people feeling comfortable with taking on texts that they might have not considered before. And she said, you know, it all has to do with context. And so she said, yeah, there might be someone who is not African American who would have trouble singing a song called "The Negro Speaks of Rivers," etc. And she said, but if it were done in a context of I'm showing a panorama of experiences for Black Americans and showing it in some kind of historical context or something about the composer, something about marginalization in general, she said, I would not have any problem with that. She also pointed out a couple of very, very good references and even Facebook pages where you can check with members of NAM, the Negro Association of Musicians. She said, you know, if you get really self-conscious about things, this is where you start doing your research, and you reach out to, you know, acquaintances you have made it, and you say, do you think this is appropriate for me to sing or a student of mine to sing? And it was, you know, there was some boxes being opened while we were having this conversation. And Lynn, certainly, that is something that I've thought about for years. I grew up on spirituals at church, and I never thought anything more about it. So I asked my friend about this, and she said, you know, you have to know your research, you have to know where the story comes from. And she said, furthermore, I think you have to have a reason to sing that particular song or those particular songs, which goes beyond just the skin color. There needs to be something that you have felt that made you sing those words and that message.
Certainly, we're seeing a lot more intentionality and thoughtfulness around programming and the decisions we make of the repertoire that we choose, which I think has been great. Nick?
And certainly there's plenty of repertoire where that is also just not an issue. There's plenty of repertoire by underrepresented composers and poets where they're just expressing human emotions, where you're not walking into something that is, you know, specific, that could only be referring to, you know, a particular group's experience in our nation's history. I have to say, I feel like I've sort of dipped my toe in the water. The biggest challenge I found with that and during the pandemic is that normally I would go running to multiple libraries and just like sit in the stacks and go through things, and that's a no-go at the moment. So one of the things I'm looking forward to once things can open up again is just going and really being able to explore repertoire beyond. I mean, I feel like there are like 5 well-known anthologies of like specifically devoted to underrepresented groups, and there's obviously a lot more repertoire available than that. So that's sort of a project that I put a pin in for later. But it's very important, and I think it's got to become part of the repertoire that everyone does, that it's not for like 1 month out of the year or for this moment where, you know, people happen to feel very charged up about it at a point in time. It really just needs to become part of the repertoire.
Absolutely. I would love to get to the point where we're not talking about programs of music by underrepresented or, you know, women composers recitals. I'm so tired of that. I like, when are we going to move past that? And this is a great first step towards moving past that. But there are still, I mean, even just women composers, which that's been a thing for a long time. That's still a thing for people to put together a recital of women composers. And it's just music. It's good music. It should be. I hope that we'll in our lifetime we'll see it for all of these groups.
I couldn't agree more. I had a discussion with a friend of mine the other day about what the canon is. You know, what are we calling the canon? And in a sense, the canon puts a framework on something that, you know, we all grew up with. Does that make that music better or more substantial or more serious or more worthy of time? And it's you know, it's felt very heated this year because of political unrest in our country. But I'm hoping that really is a silver lining that we come out of this with a new engagement with music that we may not necessarily know, and that makes us think about things in new ways and makes us hear people in different ways and all kinds of things.
Yeah, well, and I also think that, I mean, it's honestly true of all composers. I mean, I gave an assignment to a student last week who is a soprano with a wonderful voice that would be perfect for Strauss. And she brought in Morgan, and I said, well, so now your assignment for next week is to find songs that you want to sing by Richard Strauss that are not Morgan or Zweignon or like the 5 songs that everyone thinks are the only pieces that he ever wrote. So go like explore. I mean, I think that would be useful for like the composers that we're used to and any composers that we're trying to bring into the canon. Just explore.
Speaking of hearing things in new ways, we have a question from our friend Chelsea Shepard.
Oh.
So and I'll invite anyone to take this. How has it been listening to singers on Zoom? Have you found the digital distortion makes it more difficult to work on any particular aspects of technique? Lynn, go.
So yeah, I bought a really beautiful pair of open back headphones this summer, and when I first did a lesson on Zoom using those headphones, I literally cried because I thought, oh my God, I can hear my student the way I know he really sounds in real life. That has made a huge difference. But that said, the number one thing I miss the most about any face-to-face lessons is just being bathed in that sound in real life, just being in the room, hearing what the room gives to the sound, which is really difficult to hear over Zoom. It's not impossible. I have 3 students right now, two at BU and 1 private, who I have never worked with in person, and that is. I worry so much about whether I'm truly leading them the right way. I think that I am. I hope that I am. One of them just won an encouragement award, so I think that she's probably okay. But I'm really, really looking forward, especially in those cases, to meeting them in person and just hearing what they're able to do and hearing all of them. I just miss hearing them. I miss hearing anyone other than me in person. I'm pretty tired of my own voice. I don't know about all of you, but I'm tired of hearing it. I want to hear someone else.
Lynn, I actually have a question for you. Do you miss not being able to touch your students or to physically approximate?
That's probably number 2 on my list, not being able to see students in 3-dimensional form, so that I can't, it's not even so much about not being able, it's a little bit about not being able to touch them or have them put their hands on my abs or whatever, but it's really more about not being able to see them in their full three-dimensional. I can't see everything they're doing. I mean, look how we're all showing right now. And even if I have them stand further away, I can't see everything that's going on. I can't walk around behind them while they're singing. I can't, it's frustrating to not, that's a really difficult aspect of teaching in this
Yeah.
way, for sure.
Yeah.
And
I mean,
go
I
ahead.
was just going to say, I feel like, I mean, certainly since the pandemic started, last spring felt like a nightmare because part of the issue was that people didn't have the equipment yet. They didn't necessarily have a space. I mean, I literally did coachings with one student who was singing in a linen closet in their parents' house because that, you know, their parents are online and trying to work and they've got, you know, a younger sibling in school. So then they're in a small room surrounded by towels and bed sheets. So it's like, no, I didn't really feel like I could tell. But over time, certainly the school opened. So now students can use facilities app. They can use practice rooms and internet connections there. And the school got a supply of microphones, which certainly it's the microphone more than anything I found. The microphone and the internet connection can make or break an online coaching session. And I feel like I have a better handle on what I can hear over the Zoom connection and what I can't. So you know, people will come and, you know, they're singing up in the top of their register and they want to know how it's sounding. And I will say, I hear 50% static. So I can't, like, in this moment, I cannot judge for you right now. Is this like healthy? Is it completely in tune? But there are other things that we can talk about. Or honestly, you know, if you're a language coach and you're working in German and English, and I'm constantly bugging my kids about exploding, you know, T and K and P, and I find that's very hard to hear over Zoom. So there are times where I'm staring at the screen and I go, oh, okay, so I saw you move, like you must have done it because your like tongue moved in a way that would indicate that it was there, but I really can't hear one way or the other. But there are lots of other things. I mean, I find that I can work in terms of shaping phrases much better now. I'm getting a sense of, like, are we really crescendoing and decrescendoing, and certainly vowel quality and all of that. So I just choose to focus on what I know I can hear, and then the other things, there'll be a time where we can, you know, work on those other things when we're back in person. So I find it much less of a challenge now than I did certainly, you know, a year ago.
Well, we're all getting more comfortable with the whole environment, of course, and the inequities of who has a microphone and who has good Wi-Fi. That's another conversation. But I also worry about the fact that I can't control what they're hearing me do, because I demonstrate a lot in my teaching. Shannon knows this, and it's really frightening to me not to have control over what it is that they're hearing, because they don't have the nice headphones that I do. So I don't know. I just don't know how they're hearing it. And, you know, I know that sometimes when they hit a great high note and it blows out their mic, I know that it was truly resonant, and I don't get to hear it. You know, I must have been good because I couldn't hear it anymore. But, you know, I'm sure that they're getting that same thing from me too. And that's disappointing and limiting in a certain kind of way.
I heard Shannon play a recital last fall in our recital hall, and that was the second time I'd heard a student since the pandemic live, and she opened her mouth to sing, and I burst into tears. Just for that, what we have been missing. And there were 15 people in the room, and we were all loving it, and she sang gorgeously.
Yep, just some of her best singing ever, for sure. And I think a lot of it was just that sense of emotion of just being able to do it, which is such a gift, to be able to kind of have it all be new in a way. That's really, you know, it's so easy to be kind of jaded and here, you know, it's work again, here we are back at the job. But when it feels so fresh and like a real privilege and a gift to be able to do it, I think that's a really special experience for all of us.
And I think that's going to be true of pretty much everything. I mean, no one who's lived through this time is going to take for granted, like teachers or students being able to be in the same room together, which is something that none of us would have thought about ever before this. But I mean, it really does. I mean, lessons, coachings, any rehearsal that you're in of any kind, let alone performances. I mean, it's not something that you can just assume is always going to be safe. And it's a special thing to be able to do any of that.
I have another question for the three of you about I know that one of the things I miss the most is not working with collaborative pianists in my studio during the lesson. I just won't see them. But these people, these wonderful pianists I used to see every half hour, on the half hour, every hour on the half hour, and I don't see it all. I don't get to work with them, and I feel like they are really, I mean, I'm missing seeing them, but they are missing a huge piece of their education by not being in the lesson and hearing everything I'm saying or the other teachers are saying to the students. What is your feeling about that?
I couldn't agree more. On Jam Kazam, several of our teachers have been incorporating the pianist into the sessions because you can have more than 2 people on a Jam Kazam session. And recently, when we did the whole subscription to Jam Kazam, it came out of the woodwork that a lot of teachers had been including their pianist on these sessions. So at least there's something collaborative going on in the lessons. And but it's still not the same thing as being in the same room with the teacher who is standing over you, or when a teacher says, no, you really, this is what you should be listening for, or this is what I want to hear. It's not the same thing. And Lynn, I couldn't agree with you more. I think for pianists who are in a collaborative piano program, they may get it from their own teacher a little bit, but it's still not that practical experience that we have all had playing millions of voice lessons.
Dana mentioned earlier his 2 students who took the brave leap in singing and playing, or speaking and playing. And hi, kitty cat. I have a student who was preparing a big audition this year, a piano student, and she's been playing for lessons, but she didn't have anybody really to coach this big repertoire with, and she finally just took the leap to sing and play. And she's not greatly experienced in languages, but now the languages are really coming along well. And so that's been exciting to see. I obviously there's no substitute for being in the room with the teacher and the singer, but the being forced to take that step and engage with the whole music making in terms of kind of really singing and being involved with the language has been a great boon.
Well,
Yeah.
we have 3 Martin Katz students sitting here, and they are now singing and playing in master class, or in studio class, on Saturday mornings, which just made me shiver to think about.
Yes.
And I mean, really, really difficult stuff. Prose lyrique in singing and playing. I just thought I'd rather go to the dentist, you know? Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think because at DePaul, they've been able to set up that we have 4 performance halls, or 5 now, I guess, and they've been able to do that setup where there's a pianist in the green room and a teacher in the recording booth and a student on stage. That I think there have been a lot of pianists who are able to just play for lessons, and it's not exactly the same experience, but they're still able to be a part of what's going on, so everybody can talk to each other and at least see each other on a little screen. I have to say, from a singer perspective, I find that, but my students had always appreciated the pianists that they work with, but I think all of my students now have a much deeper understanding of what their collaborative pianist does for them, like moment by moment in real time when they're singing. And they've really gotten that from all of these like, I have yet to work with one person with a track made by anyone or any electronic device that actually works. And that's not to disparage anyone who has played to make any of those tracks. They're useful, but they're never going to be a substitute for a real person. And I think our students really now much more deeply understand what's involved in being able to collaborate, because they've spent a significant amount of time essentially collaborating with something that's paying no attention to what they're doing. And I don't have a single student who isn't getting more and more and more eager and looking forward more and more to being able to work with a pianist in real time.
Absolutely. We've got about 10 minutes left, and so I just wanted to invite anyone has tuned in, if they'd like to contribute to the discussion with a comment or questions. We are still here, and we are open to that. But speaking of piano tracks, that's a stressful thing, huh? it's a stressful thing for pianists who have to make them, but also just to kind of have to deal with. And as Nick said, not to disparage anybody, it's such hard work to put together, and there's just no ideal way. I wonder if this is kind of on the spot, I guess, but if either of you coaches or Lynn, if you have any tips for how to make the most of that kind of situation, either for pianists as they're making tracks or for singers when they're communicating the pianists about what they need in terms of tempi, rubato, that type of thing. What have you learned about that? Nick says, nope.
I had a moment of terror at the beginning of all of this, frankly, that we would discover that none of us were actually needed anymore because, computers and electronics had advanced to the point. Because you'd hear about, well, there's this app and they can, take time here and change tempo and everything. I'm like, oh, I'm going to be out of a job. Like I have to switch careers. And I really have to say, in December, one of my former students and her boyfriend, they put together this beautiful Beethoven festival, absolutely amazing. And as part of it, there was a performer who, we should all be so talented, amazing singer and an amazing pianist. So they put together a video where the same person made a track of the piano part to a song cycle and then recorded themselves singing it with that track. And even within the same human being, it's the same brain engaged in both activities, because every single performance is different. You never know in the moment if you're going to need a little bit more time to breathe or you need a faster tempo today than you did yesterday. It was an amazing performance. Again, we should all be so talented, but there was still, if you were really listening, you could tell there were still just little moments where there were just little things that weren't necessarily together that would never happen in real life. And that was sort of a moment where I went, okay, I'm not going to obsess over this. If the same person cannot just wonderfully successfully do this, that's really saying something about how difficult it is to make a track that somehow anticipates what people are going to need to do. And I have to say, honestly, when I'm coaching students, I will let them sing through, for the very first time, go ahead, sing it through with your track. And at this point, we ditch it immediately. And then they're just singing a cappella and we're working on phrases a cappella. It's just, there's no point in trying to be with a track that's a little too fast or a little too slow, or they're learning to rush cadenzas because it's not enough time, or they're putting fermati over things that don't get fermati because they're waiting for the piano part to come back in. It's just not worth it. And they're all getting so good at being independent musically that I feel like that's a much more valuable skill than trying to figure out how to be with a track.
Yeah, I'm constantly telling them, don't worry about it. I mean, it's so much more important to communicate and breathe and sing than to worry about being with the track at all times. It's just not, especially once I realized that a lot of people, when they're in between phrases, instead of really breathing, they were waiting and trying to listen and align. And that's death to music and art. And nobody needs you to be with the track at every step of the way, is what I keep telling them. And I see heads nodding, so I'm glad that you all agree.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the big sacrifice in all of this is recitative, and I'll sing and play something at home and I'm like, well, this is the way I would do it. And I send it and then I hear it with the student. I just think I'm not even in the same time zone that they are. And partially, I mean, let's be frank, for a lot of our students, recitative is challenging and they're used to, we have a lot of students who grow up with choral conductors doing this all the time, and all of a sudden all of that has gone by the wayside. It's not being dictated by somebody else, and so I have just said to my students, I said, we're not doing recitative on tracks. Why, please just turn it off and do it a cappella. And Nick, I'm going to be more bold and just saying, let's just hear this a cappella. And that's another silver lining, is that students are getting much more conditioned to just sing. I mean, you practice by yourself a great deal of the time. You don't have a pianist there necessarily. So let's hear it without anything underneath you. And sometimes it's amazing what you can learn, isn't it?
Well, and what better way to practice your chords than a recitative. You're not trying to keep time necessarily in a Duparc song, but you want to practice being able to find C major, G major, D major, G minor. That's like 40% of your recitative needs right there. So yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah. I don't think I have a single student who hasn't come through this without the realization that most of the time, unfortunately, young singers can tend to be pretty passive, right? In their music making. They're so reliant on what they're hearing and reactive, right? They're always just that little bit behind because they're waiting for some kind of cue. And I've been really grateful to have the opportunity to kind of abandon that, right? And really help train my singers to be in the driver's seat all of the time because they have to be. And the other skill that I'm really honing in on right now is conducting while we sing, right? And conducting those recorded tracks so that we're embodying what's happening and not just listening and reacting and trying to respond. And so that's been a real gift too. I don't know if my students realize it has been, but I'm thrilled. It's been great. Great for me. So we've just got a few minutes left, and before, I don't want to forget to do this. So again, please, if you have any questions, feel free to submit them. But I also want to let everyone know that if you're enjoying this conversation, we have another episode of Heard Over the Piano taking place next Thursday at a special time. So normally we're in the evenings, but we have a wonderful dear friend and special guest, Juliet Petrus, who will be speaking to us about singing in Mandarin. This is a special passion of Juliet's. Some of you may remember a recital that she did, Nick, went with 2 or 3 seasons ago for us, all in Mandarin. And she has recently published a book, kind of the diction guide to singing in Mandarin. So she's going to join us next week to talk about that. And that will take place at 3 p.m. Central Time because Juliet is dialing in from London. So we'll be seeing her a little bit earlier in the day. Also wanted to let you all know that in about a month from now, we'll have our Winter Leader Lounge with Edward Nelson and his wonderful pianist, whose name I have to look up very quickly, and because I don't want to say it wrong. But that will be airing March 5th through 7th, and pianist is Ronnie Michael Greenberg. And I believe there will be a Heard Over the Piano series with Ronnie Michael Greenberg as well, so that will be coming up in the next few weeks. Thank you. Very good. And it airs March 4th, excuse me. So any other final thoughts as we wrap up? It's been great to see the 3 of you and hear your insights. And in the time we have left, do you have a few words of advice to young singers out there as they navigate the next few months, or anything that you're particularly looking forward to on the other side of this? Live music for sure, but
I want to pick up on something that Lynn said. I think that we are seeing in our students their form of grit through this. Like if you want this to happen, you have to work extra hard and you have to be willing to live within certain parameters in order to make it happen. And I have to say that I've seen some of that, and some of it's been very, very surprising. And yet with other people, it's also been surprising that they haven't shown their adaptability to this. So it's a time for people to really examine why they do things and hopefully get more enjoyment out of it than they ever have before.
Agreed. Anybody else? Final thoughts moving forward? Oh, Lynn? Or no, are you?
Almost made it through the whole call without hearing someone say, "You're on mute." Sorry, everyone. No, my final thought would be just keep at it, but also stay with the technology and keep getting comfortable with it, because that's not going anywhere. And that the more you can be comfortable on camera and be conversant with all of the programs and things that you need to know, that the better off you'll be as things evolve even further. And I look forward to hopefully seeing you all back in my studio in September, God willing.
Nick, any final
Yeah,
thoughts?
I mean, I'd still say the same thing. I was trying to give advice to my students the last day that we had in-person classes last spring, which was to say, just focus on what can be done right now. And I think that's even a little bit easier now because we can see that there's light at the end of the tunnel. You know, last March, we had no idea, was this going to be a few weeks, a few months, a few years? And I think we know more now. So it's a time to explore repertoire and to firm up musicianship skills and languages. And maybe you can't be actively performing as much as you like, but you can build up a whole lot of skills that'll serve you really well, you know, once we're able to do things in person. And I have to say that as weird as this was to do in the beginning, to shift everything online and change everything, the students that I have been so amazingly just patient and flexible about everything. And I know it's been an easier lift for some than others, but everyone has really, they've been amazing. And it's really been a bright spot for me in all of this. I feel the best when I'm spending the most time teaching my students, rather than sort of stewing and wondering about like what's going to happen to our society and our country and our world, and, you know, who's going to get sick and who's going to make it. I mean, it's really been a real light in my life to be able to teach my students through all of this.
Here, here. I think we all have the same, we're all in agreement about that. Really blessed. And we are at time. It is 8:02. I feel like I'm running an official meeting. This meeting is now adjourned. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you for a really great conversation. And I learned a lot from each of you, and I'm sure our listeners did as well. Wishing you all three the very best in the next few weeks and the coming months, and looking forward to seeing you in person and to attending concerts together and hugs and all of those wonderful things that we're missing. I've been grateful for this series because it allows us to have a little bit of community. And so thank you for being part of that community, all three of you.
Shannon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take
Thank you,
care.
Shannon.
Absolutely. See
Good
you
night,
soon.
everybody.
Bye. Bye.